This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
I was looking at Twitter and I think this is... But I think you asked me what
conversation
yes.
you picked up today you want to take forward?
Well, unfortunately I've had this horrible day, but I've been wanting to have conversations with each and every one of you, but I seem to be running around and training to talk to anybody. But really, I'm really excited. I think there's a lot of conversations to be had. I suppose one conversation that I want to sort of start today and carry on is, what can we do going forward? In the future, what can we do from tomorrow to carry on, the kind of energy that I've felt in the room today? And I think, it's all very well to have this event. We've had lots of great presentations, lots of interesting material, but I think as some of the questions at the end of the last panel were raising, I think it was the similar here, but I think it's like, well, what can we do to change the world? Really is that conversation. But how can we take these kind of ideas that we've been talking about forward? How can we affect decision makers, not just sort of policy makers in Westminster, but just the general decision makers and knowledge producers. I can use the terms I've heard somewhere else, but there's decision makers in our society. How can we kind of influence and change that public conversation? I suppose two really specific things that I've been talking to people about today. I know there are quite a lot of people from educational backgrounds, one way or another, professionally, and I think we all, those of us who are kind of on the historian side of it, researching, need to do more to think about how we can translate what we found out into classroom settings, into TV commissioners' offices. How can we tell these stories? And people like TV commissioners and classroom teachers, don't have time to do the research. We have to package it for them in different ways so that they can just take it on out there, straight into the classroom, straight onto our TV screens. We need to think about that. And the other thing, I had a really good suggestion from Ian Duffield was saying is, do we have a bibliography of Black British history? I mean, I chucked a few books on the desk this morning, but each and every one of you probably has some lists of books on their computers that it would be good for us to pull all of those and do that work to kind of organise, well, what do we know? What books are out there? What books would you recommend for the subjects that you've looked at, that you're interested in, to kind of create that list of knowledge that, there's a way forward. Sorry, we shouldn't have started.
Tony, do you want to share your
I came a bit late. I came at 4 o'clock, so I can only say what I saw from that point. So let me pick up on what Milton Brown was doing up there in Huddersfield. So in London, what we're doing here is collaborating with various universities to actually put on events which are led by Black female academics. So we call them the Queen and Zinga Lecture Series. We've had 22 so far. The 22nd is actually this weekend. And basically, we make sure we can access lecture theatres in universities across London, and we give women, Black women, 3 hours to speak about their area of expertise. So the last 2 years we've been doing that. We've had in fact, this weekend we got a lecture called How True African Dance Was Corrupted into Porn. And it does what it says in the tin. So it's all about African dance, its original form, how it's corrupted into porn, and that's been led by one called Maddie, who's a choreographer from France. And that kind of links in the community to the universities. It uses their spaces, but we use our expertise to tell our stories. And they've been very popular. This one that's coming up this Saturday has something like 370 people booked to attend. We just did one, it wasn't a Queen and Zinga lecture, because apart from doing the Queen and Zinga lectures, which is just Black women, we also have lectures at other university sites, which is led by, sometimes by me and other people. And the one we did at South Bank yesterday was called the Black History Comedy, and we had 3 people turn up that. So it's a way of using universities' resources and using community expertise to tell these stories of African Caribbean people and get them out there, because it's really good that we have all this expertise there, but we need to get information out to the population, and that is one way of doing it in a fairly democratic, open basis. People come along, take notes, take that. And the other thing we've been doing is we've been filming most of the lectures and then uploading to our YouTube channel. So we have about 12 of the lectures we've done are actually on YouTube right now on our channel, and they range from literature to resistance to African queens who fought back. So there's a whole bunch of stuff there that we're doing, which is using modern technology, but also it's linking the community into universities.
Sure.
Right, when I came this morning on the Underground, I read the Metro, and there's a story about some research that's just been published that suggests that we're nearly as grumpy as the French due to low levels of serotonin, daylight problems, and this makes us look always the glass half full, or half empty, not the other way around. And there is always in debates about black history and where we have arrived at a particular point at which a lot of people think there is no progress. And I think there has been an enormous amount of progress, some of which we've heard about today. The kind of event we've had today could not have been held in the way it has 10 years ago, or possibly even 5 years ago. Now the problem with making further progress is when we're critical of institutions like universities or schools, we're also talking about the problem of how do you change all those individuals and their individual attitude. And that takes an enormous length of time to influence the way people think, and then to get new policies and procedures adopted by institutions. The number of stories grows and grows and grows. The amount of literature that has come out in the last 3 or 4 years is immense. Those of us who are involved in British black history are probably drowning with the amount of stuff that is now coming out available to read, and how we translate that into our work at particularly local levels. And we need always, those of us who are involved in getting that information around and publishing stories like Esther Bruce, 20th century black seamstress, and Bill Miller, docker, who became the leading cats from Plymouth. It's a struggle to get those known about and sold, and we need so all the publishers involved across the board need support. But what worries me is that we are actually in a totally new situation, let's say compared with 5 years ago and 10 years ago. The toxic mix of racism, continued institutional racism, anti-immigration, the way in which politicians are dividing off different social groups against each other is becoming very dangerous, and UKIP is much more difficult to combat than the British National Party was, or the National Front before it. So what some of us are trying to do, certainly in Creighton, is to try and use black British history, and indeed American black history, to raise issues about racism and combat and look at the changing situation. And what I find is that those people who would regard themselves as not prejudiced are strengthened in their view about the contribution that black people have made in Britain. People often say to me at events, I've got to rethink my attitude to British history as I have learnt it. And I think that's very positive, and that needs to go on all over the place. But the real challenge to me is how do we use that history to try and combat some of the worst stuff that's coming out, particularly in UKIP, and will get worse and worse over the next 6 months.
Thank you. I'm Caroline Bressey. My own research is mostly based on particularly black women in the 19th century London and Britain. And it happens when you move towards the end of the table, but have you got anything particularly additional to add? In the sense that I agree with things that have gone before. So I might just highlight something that I felt was maybe a little bit missing from today, or could be thought about a little bit more. Bearing in mind that I agree with what people have said, the politics of it and the issues of research. but also particularly thinking about women's history. I was thinking a little bit about where the women were in the stories that we've been thinking about. And it's not that they haven't been mentioned at all, but the way feminist history over the last 20 years, sort of running parallel to discussions in Black history perhaps, how those quite serious questions that women brought up, it's there in some things like the importance of family history, the importance of the home as a sort of a side to think about these kinds of histories. And I think that can link in really interesting ways to the politics of UKIP and trying to think about how integrated people were in communities and in families, that they weren't segregated migrants in the way that history is kind of repackaged sometimes. But thinking of the last film about the music and the sound system, I didn't see any women in that. And it might be that was just the clip that you showed. But maybe there's a role of academia to highlight those kinds of things. Well, these are things that people have been talking about in the academy, and not just in the academy, of course, feminism is an activist movement as well. And although hinted at also issues of histories of sexuality, how do they get fed in to the kind of sort of histories that we've been doing for some time now in Black history? And I think it's hopefully a moment where we can move on to adding the complexities to the stories that we're telling, not simply kind of retelling the present story, although that clearly has a place and we clearly obviously have to keep telling that. I think making that history more complex and embracing some of the more difficult aspects maybe of telling historical stories is something that we could think about doing over the next 5 to 10 years as well.
Thanks. Well, I'd like to add to what Miranda said. I think one of the most important things is the educational aspect of actually putting research out there. I rather like the idea of all us researchers, solitary occupation, clinging like, go on, mine. I also thought that this is the problem really, that putting things out there, if you aren't an expert in that particular area, I've never taught, but I've done some adult education, but I don't really know how to present the information that I have got, how to put it out there. I think there's a huge amount that could be done, perhaps not to look at Black British history, but simply when you're doing any history project, say you're doing crime, why don't we use a Black person involved in crime, not a criminal, but a victim of crime in the 18th century, to show what a normal thing it was, what a normal part of life they were. I mean, I'm just throwing that out as an idea, but I do think, yes, that actually I will be thinking more about what kind of resources that we can use, what kind of stories we can tell, and how to put those across.
Yeah, afternoon everyone. I'm getting about halfway through today's proceedings as well. And I'd just like really to return to the question which prompted today's activities, what's happening in Black history? Well, evidently a huge amount is happening. There's actually, as Sean was hinting, a bit of a deluge of information, and navigating and processing that is all sorts of problems, welcome and unwelcome. But if it's not too ungracious, I'd just like to twist the question slightly and ask what's happening to Black history. And it might not be a discourtesy to suggest that what's happening to Black history is what has happened to, let's say, the Notting Hill Carnival. It is actually becoming British. And is indeed this event part of that process, and how can this be navigated? I'm not at all just putting cats amongst pigeons. I'm asking this very, very serious thing. And yes, with the Notting Hill Carnival in mind, you can see where I'm going with this. Now, why this matters is obviously the ground has been set for the contest over contested histories has begun. Although it would be fascinating to see how, for example, a lot of the subjects that we're interested in make their way, if they ever do, onto the curriculum, that's just more battlefields. I mean, do we want a curriculum which does have Black British history, but only features, say, Equiano and Mary Seacole? Everyone loves Mary Seacole for a number of reasons, again, which you can intuit by my tones. And how can we actually get people like Robert Wedderburn and George Padmore on the curriculum? I mean, these are the challenges that bring really challenging histories into the mainstream. But yes, I'm not all gloom and doom. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening. For me, the most fascinating thing that's happened recently is something which seems to have gone under many people's radars. I'm a big believer in community access, community activity, grassroots stuff coming from the bottom up. And I'm fascinated by developments in Lewisham at the moment. Several years ago, I did an address to the Lewisham Local History Society. I was the only non-white person in the room. I was the only person below pensionable age apart from me in the room. They actually began the proceedings by announcing the passings on of a couple of members. And I've since rejoined digitally the Lewisham Local History Group, and it's been actually elegantly, beautifully hijacked by David Michael, the police pioneer, as he describes himself, black police pioneer, I should have stressed. And what has happened is that the Lewisham History Group, or Local History Society, has been taken over by an overwhelming majority, by several dozen very focused, very active, very hands-on black and Asian people. And yes, they're still keeping the local histories alive, but what they're doing is actually reflecting the reality that a lot of low-level history and heritage institutions are going to be dealing with, which is that local history in many parts of these islands is already and will become more increasingly minority histories. And they're already ahead of the game, ahead of the curve, and taking hold of that, as well as cherishing the histories of Indigenous Britons. So yeah, I'm just throwing these out as things to really flag up and yeah, discuss.
Okay, firstly, I need a volunteer.
To the mic. Yeah.
Okay, the floor's open
Now
now.
the work, make sure the other one works. So, yeah.
The floor's open now. I'll take 3 questions and then begin to plan. So who's first?
Hi, I'm Kathleen. First, the question, a really silly, simple question. Where do you want us to put our questionnaires? Where do you want us to put our questionnaires?
The question is, you bring them to the front, give them to me,
Okay.
I'll take responsibility.
And then going back to, more seriously, going back to the first comment, Rand's comment on bibliography, it's absolutely very, very important thing to have. If I can help with compiling that simple offer, so I'll just pass on now.
So what's your name?
Tessa Hosking.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, again, yeah, just so me and a couple of my friends were talking, and we were wondering who's documenting, say, the black history of under 30s. Like, this feels very much like, you know, in the, not in the past, because I think in the past, but history, but it feels, I feel like there's a cut-off point where we're just wondering who's documenting us, you know, like the Wings March, 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, blah, blah. What about our experiences, the fact that culture is constantly evolving, you know, it shifts, there's so much change happens. So, for example, we were saying that actually for us when it comes to black history, the place that we often see ourselves is in literature. So Chimamanda Adichie's Americana is something that I can very much understand because she talks about the, I know, not the crisis I'd say, but just of growing up in the diaspora, having to navigate those two spaces, and I'm just curious to know who's doing that for young black
Okay, do you want a third question?
I suppose it's more of a comment that I kind of like to respond to. I was kind of interested in what you were saying, Steve, about Equiano and Seacole and Milia narratives.
And I just kind of wanted to know the panel's thoughts on the value of reframing familiar narratives. It seems to me that neither of those people are as safe and mainstream as they might have been presented in schools' histories, and they can both be read in subversive lights, as subversive people. And I suppose it's about interpretation, about how we read histories and how we can use them in ways that can be presented in more radical ways.
Okay, let's just take the question of who's documenting the history of the 30s. I guess the youngest, tends to be the youngest on the panel. Okay.
Do you want to pass that mic?
I think I'm pretty loud, personally. Can you all hear me?
Sorry.
Okay. Well, I'm sadly now over 30, just about. But I suppose I hear what you're saying. I think that trend in the literature, you can see it in other novels as well. I was thinking immediately about Andrea Levy's book that's got lemon in the title. I can't remember the whole title. Fruit of the Lemon. Fruit of the Lemon. And not to confuse with Orange Not Being Fruit. And Zadie Smith's White Teeth, all that stuff. I suppose. I mean, my research was 500 years ago, so it's all this. I mean, that's just not history. That's too modern for me. But I suppose I'd actually want to throw that question back at you and say, well, what are you doing to document your experience? And maybe it's something. I've got my archive of love letters under my bed. Where's yours? But I think that ephemera. We all have that kind of piled up at home, I suppose. But I think that there are, I suppose, the mediums are changing. Kathleen sort of uses a lot of newspapers and court records from the 18th century. The sources I can find from the 16th century are different, like parish registers. So those medieval documents that Hannah dismissed in her presentation, but sort of placed in one box, actually also can speak to the history we're talking about. Each century, how we'll have different resources, but I always imagine that the historians of the future who are looking at the early 21st century are going to have to be techno experts as well, who'll be able to find ancient hard drives and extract information out of them and find all your emails, all the videos you've made, anything you ever upload to YouTube is in a way a document of your life. It's kind of, well, how would we tell your stories, of our stories, of our generation? And I think that's something that's still happening, but there's nothing to stop you from starting to blog about it or do anything you like with it. I think it's something that you don't necessarily want to just find some professional historian to do it for you. Do it yourself. But I think that literature and art and other cultural kind of expressions have got a lot to sort of do to add to that.
Can I just add to on a personal note? I just know what Miranda said. You used to go so late today. Look at Jamal Edwards and SBT. Look at Alcala with his Twitter, with his Facebook feed. So I turn it back and say, it's there. You guys have got great history, great people talking the case, and even right up to today. This group just won the American Prize, the Young Fathers. What they're saying about being living in Edinburgh, and look at their background, what they're doing. So it's an exciting time to be young. Exciting time to be old.
We've had our poetic intervention at lunchtime as well.
Exactly.
Did you hear Samuel King at lunchtime?
And I said it's all part of the analogy. So going back to Sean's point, 5 years ago, would you mind the dumb poet party? Let's come on to the question of reframing the narrative.
Sorry, because I just probably talked too much. I can't stop that. I just wanted to respond to this
young lady as well. It strikes me that obviously as a young person you're interested in young people's stories, but it strikes me that many of the stories that we're talking about are the stories of young people. So if you think about Windrush, parents were young, they came in as they were young, A lot of the people that we saw in the pictures, in the presentations, were young people, adventurers, trying new things, under 30s, many of them. And those stories, I think, are really interesting and it's sort of relevance, seems to be, potentially, to young people.
I guess what I was also trying to say is kind of Milton's point about co-production, because I feel like having our history documented close to like the time that we're here, also helps with future generations and their experiences, and I understand the usefulness of definitely going back, but I also feel like it needs to be current, so it's kind of using the past to go forward, and I guess that's what I'm trying to kind of get to, is like how to use linking all of these experiences.
Spark some thoughts.
I agree with this young lady here. I would like to see more current Black British history taught in school, histories that young people can connect to. I've lost both my parents who came over in the early 50s, and I'd like to see their histories. That would be my children's grandparents. I'd like to see them being able to connect to those histories of those Windrush generation, and even my own generation, which was well, a bit hairy at times in the 70s and all the riots and things. The only film that I think I could connect to and relate to was, I don't know if anyone's seen The Story of Lovers Rock by Menelik Shabazz, and that would cover, Caroline, some of the feminism things that were happening in the 70s, because of course that made up my teenage years and things like that, as growing up in the 70s here, which Lovers Rock, a lot people, especially white people over here, didn't realise our histories at all. I remember Bonnie Greer at one meeting saying, "Oh, I don't know nothing about Black British people. I've written a book, and one of the characters, she was Black British." But then I thought, I don't know nothing about Black British people, so I have to make her a mute. Her character will be mute. And one of the things is we are hidden. And I'd like to see our histories documented. It was just amazing to go and watch that film, because finally someone had put my childhood in film.
I just wanted to flag up the Black Cultural Archives Youth Forum, which I know Hannah will know more about than I do. But they have a very active youth forum about young people engaging in the archive. So yeah.
I'll just take one more comment on this, then come back to this lady here.
I think there are quite a few books around as well. I know a lot of people don't read that many books, but there's books by Lloyd Bradley and David Katz on the sound systems and like music. And I think the one thing that I'm a bit worried about is I've always read lots of Caribbean and African fiction, and Longmans, who used to produce a lot of them, they seem to have stopped churning them out, and they're quite difficult to get hold of now. But there are a lot of young Black British writers coming up, people like Dira Adebayo, and around Brixton as well. There was also loads of spoken word stuff going on. So I think there are those things, and I have in the past, when I've been working in libraries, tried to persuade the libraries to invite more young people in to do spoken word, and that's quite a difficult thing to do, but I think there are lots of things. It just needs people with the power to open up their minds a little bit.
Okay, you guys happy with that? Are you not being inspired to like
Yes.
Let's imagine this question reframing and have it go to history. Let's
Do I need the mic? Yes. Is that better? So, it's a while since I've read Mary Seacole stuff, but I think Equiano has the you can reframe Equiano a lot more easily than you can reframe Mary Seacole. I think she is quite a complicated character to celebrate. Actually, I'm not very comfortable with that narrative that has come with that for all sorts of reasons. But you can see why it's happened. But so yeah, I think I guess that's kind of what I was hinting at, and the importance of thinking about women's histories and histories of sexualities and histories that will come that we haven't yet thought of. There's a constant need to reframe history all the time. But it's not always going to be done by historians. I think, that you mentioned literature, and, I think novels have a really important part to play. The non-fiction has a really important part to play in filling in the gaps that we can't find out about. And, using imagination. I'm a geographer, so it's not all done by historians. So I think, you know, that the co-production isn't just between sort of historians, academic historians, and people in the community, whatever that division might be, as if academic historians aren't also members of communities. But also that there's a huge, you know, that it's about filmmakers and TV producers and geographers, and I think literature has a really interesting part to play. So I think that's partly historians can't do everything, and other people take that work and use it and develop it in different ways. But also all narratives need to be sort of reconsidered and reframed and rethought all the time. And I think that is perhaps one of the most important roles of academic scholars, that perhaps they're more better, or they have an opportunity maybe to do that and think about that.
I've got nothing against Equiano. I simply love the autobiography. I think there's a huge amount there that hasn't been looked at. People only look at the political aspects of his life, you know, only see him in that light. And that's true of a lot of other people. There's been nothing done, for example, on Ignatius Sancho, who has done a huge amount of things. So there is definitely a decision that some people are okay, they are the right kind of black person to look at, others are not. I do think that there are just so many there who could be considered. Boston King, for example, all the autobiographers, there are loads of them, but the only one that anybody ever looks at is Oliver Equiano, because he had a political role, I suspect. But in fact, he says some really interesting things. A lot of the biographers tell us all sorts of things that aren't in the history books. You know, it's very interesting. And also, to get back to my interesting thing about crime, there are two black people in the 18th century who set legal precedents. Okay, the first one swore on the Quran instead of the Bible. He asked to swear on the Quran. I think it's 1767. They had a think about it, and they said, oh yeah, okay, fine. And the second one was a woman, she was mixed race, she was murdered by her husband because he wanted to marry someone else. And they called the local parish, took her in to look after her. They called in a surgeon, they called in a physician to treat her. And before she died, they got in the local JP to take down her dying sort of statement, and that was used as evidence in a trial, which it hadn't done before. And a few years later, another guy also learned the wife, and she, in the similar circumstances, he questioned whether you could actually have, if somebody dead could give a truthful account. And they said, hang about, we've already done this with Sylvia Woodcock. She set the precedent. So there you are, two black people setting precedents, not now.
Yeah, just a quick point. I think, yeah, just a kind of positive. I think there are things being done on Ignatius. I mean, when you said there's nothing being done on Ignatius Sancho, I just felt I had to say that last year now, the British Library actually acquired 15 of his original handwritten autograph letters signed by him, which is great news, I think, on many levels, one of which that a British institution of the sort that we like to sling mud at has actually done something positive for the kind of history we're interested in, but also, you know, it's allowing scholars. I think Vincent Coretta, his autobiographer, is studying this, and I think Ryan Handley, who's here as well, has been looking at those. But ask Ryan what the letters are like, because he's actually seen them. And they, you know, that's helping us learn more about that figure. But anyway.
Right, I mean, I think that discussion illustrates the point and links to the issue of bibliographies. A lot of us don't actually know what is out there. Arthur Torrington and his colleagues did a fantastic project through the Equiano Society on Sancho a few years back with lots of resource material, etc. I wonder how many people in this room actually know that that exists. And it's very difficult to get hold of a lot of these small-scale resources. So not only do we need a bibliography, but we need a guide to resources, not just those that are kind of currently around and easily accessible, but to past ones, so that we don't get this kind of confused debate. On the reframing, Equiano, I mean, I always talk about, when I talk about Equiano, I always set him in the context of his role in support of the fight for democracy in this country. The same with William Cuffy. Equiano supported the London Correspondence Society. His friend and colleague in that was one of the people they attempted to convict for treason because of the politics that they were engaged in. So, for example, you can build Equiano and Cuffy as the London Chartist leader. You can build them into anything you do in schools on the fight for democracy and how democracy developed in this country. And if you want to look at two brilliant books that will be useful for schools and for people who can't read small print, etc., Martin Hoyle's books on Cuffy and Caruana came out last week, are a brilliant way of contextualizing two lives for which we don't have enough information on, but within the development of capitalism, slavery as a driver of capitalist development, of the fight for democracy, working class resistance, etc. I really highly recommend those are published by Hansen.
Some more questions?
Right. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for putting this on, because I think it's important having that. Okay. I think the idea of having an academic institution as a mixture of academia and community historians, that's quite useful, because sometimes I think academics only talk to themselves and history needs to be widened up. So I really appreciate what you put together. I want to talk about the curriculum because it's mentioned a lot. I think the curriculum is a certain beast that takes time to change, and even we come up with everything we want in the curriculum. So I think we should not be expending so much of our effort on the curriculum. We should look outside it. Now, if you have something in the curriculum, that doesn't mean it will be taught in school, right? So I would suggest that if we're passionate about a certain area, we should go to schools and find a champion and say, look, these are, whether it's Winterbourne, Kukwano, or whatever, or sound system, we should go to schools and get someone within history as a champion to get on with it. So that's what I wanted to contribute. Thank you very much.
Just a comment as well. And I've listened to the whole day, and as a teacher educator, one of the benefits I have of today moving it forward is that we can actually see how much research and high quality and thinking and cognitive processes go into working with sources. And teachers need to understand that Black history has a lot of credibility for the academic community. Now, Michael Gove talks a lot about having a high quality history curriculum. Now, what I've seen today can be easily integrated to actually illustrate what that will look like. And drawing on what the presentations were focusing on, if teachers can see the value of that, they can understand there are wider pedagogical benefits from doing Black history that go beyond issues of identity and actually raise standards, hopefully, in their own schools. Just going back to the history for the under-30s, I would say think conceptually about personal history and family history, and look at how you see yourselves as second or third generation British-born Black people. How do you position yourself in contemporary history as well as recent history? And one more final point, just in terms of the presentations, we saw a lot of practical ways to think about diaspora today. And that helps us to connect to the past as well as to look at the present. So I think conceptually there's a lot more work we can do on making those themes practical and relevant to students as well as the education community. So thank you.
Martin Spafford, I want to raise another question. I was really interested in the paper that came with David Olusoga and really enjoyed his programs in the summer. And one of the things that was so enjoyable and fascinating was the connected and untold stories. His stories of the Senegalese in the French army, the African Americans in the French army, the Chinese laborers, the East Africans, I'm going across those stories, who had a commonality as well as a difference. If, and this is what I want to raise, perhaps in the context of with young people growing in our society, in a culturally diverse society, if a conference on Black British history had happened 30 years ago, with a different political environment, there would probably have been a mixture of people of the African diaspora and the Asian diaspora together. Is the fact that we're not in that situation, is that a weakness or a strength that we're in at the moment? Would it be stronger if that perception that existed 30 years ago, that, if you like, a black identity was about the shared experience of being colonised peoples coming to this country? If those untold stories, if we were having that dialogue that was wider than the African diaspora, would that be a greater strength, or would it be, in fact, a weakness? Are we stronger in the way we're doing it now? I'm raising that not necessarily that I think I can see arguments in both directions. I know it's a controversial issue, but I think it is an important one to consider.
Okay, we'll take that. Tony,
I go back to, well, I'll pick on a few things. First of all, the under 30s women's perspective. If you come to any Unison lectures, you notice that most of them are actually in their early 30s or maybe the late 40s, and they're talking about stuff that's relevant to them. So even if you have, for example, Candice Jabir, she's talking about 6,000 years of the Afro come. She's not just talking about 6,000 years of the Afro, she's talking about what it's like to have natural hair in the 21st century. If you come to lectures by Dr. Natalie Manu, she's talking about symbolic violence, which is about, well, symbolic violence is a long thing to explain, but she's talking about that and how it relates to modern day society. And then you have Dr. Alfie Legal-Miller, she's talking about movies and how they relate to gender and class and race. So we do a lot of stuff as part of the ongoing exhibition of black female academics. And they don't have to be academics by having a degree or whatever. As long as you have an expert knowledge of a particular subject, you can present on the lectures. Reframing the history, well, yeah, I mean, we have a presentation called How Black People Won World War II with Proof. And that goes back to Mr. Spafford and Rika Sherwood back in the old days when they had that book called How Colonials Did Colonials Win the War, something like that, right? So it's about even retitling the history that's like, because World War II is on the curriculum, it's not World War I is on the curriculum as well. And it's just a question of giving it that title, saying how black people won World War II. It's like, what are you talking about? What they even did in the first place? But you can actually do that quite easily. And the other thing we've done to reframe the history is to do the Black History Wars, because I'm not the first guy to do Black History Wars, that's not true at all. They've been going for quite a long time. But the ones that we have in St. Paul's, Michael and Cass, whatever, they become internationally known. So we actually have groups of white university American students who are booking to come to the war 6 months in advance, from Florida, from New York, from Ohio, and then come into London to do a Black History War because they've heard about it. So it's a question of you title it how you want to title it, and then that title will intrigue people from America who book 3-4 months in advance. As far as the diversity of the people, of the audience today, well, I think if you go back to slavery or civil rights, you always have to have white people allied to your cause, otherwise it makes things far more difficult to progress. So I can't see that being a problem. And I think in fact there should be more white people here, really, because this is all history as well. It's not like just for black people's history, it's British history, and it's just that there's been a section that's been ignored, deleted or suppressed, and more people need to know about it.
So I think the point you're making is that back in the 60s, black was seen as African and Asian together. It was kind of moved apart. And is that a benefit or a disadvantage?
Yeah, if this diverges as benefit or disadvantage, well, it's both, isn't it? Economically, it's a terrible disadvantage, but organisationally, I think it's a positive thing and it must be embraced because, particularly when we're dealing with the histories of people of African origin, particularly in the African diaspora, the tone of voice, the approach, the attitude, I believe, needs to be formed honestly by an experience of peculiar forms of racism, which I think uniquely affected peoples of African origin within the diaspora. Without that, it just becomes abstract. It becomes, well, sort of study amongst others, which is fine, as long as it's identified as that. But there is a particular set of stories and a particular way in which the stories are told, which I think need to be respected and honoured and should be central and sacred in these narratives, at least the narratives that our communities of African origin, we say and communicate amongst ourselves. So it's not simply about collecting information, it's how it is spread. What's the other thing? So just very briefly, I was really, I was really impressed by the two gentlemen from Hampstead, their creativity, their confidence in their young people, the faith in them, their own knowledge. But I think they're really countercultural, genuinely countercultural, compared to most of the teachers I've met who would not have the time or the confidence and creativity to put together such a wonderful set of resources.
On the subject of the difference between people of African origin and people who come from this sort of Indian subcontinent and from other areas of Asia, the problem is that the cultural differences, the only thing that they have in common is that they were once colonised. But the experiences under colonisation were so different. They also have such different cultural backgrounds and expectations that to lump them all together and say, well, hey, you was just all, colonised, it doesn't begin to deal with the complexity of all the different situations. That's, my take on it.
Mine's different. I guess I'm old-fashioned. I still think black in its broadest sense is a useful thing, politically and intellectually, particularly looking at 19th century archives where it's really difficult to unpack what blackness was. Blackness wasn't stable, and to argue that it can be claimed by a particular ethnicity is not helpful and it's not accurate. So that's one side. I can see the arguments on both sides too, but I think increasingly as it becomes a debate, it's also it's a really difficult one because it's never going to be defined or agreed. People will always have different opinions for different reasons. I think it's a real danger that you spend, as we used to do at BASA conferences, hours and hours arguing about the name rather than thinking about how you take things forward. So I think that would be no one's going to ever convince me to only ever call myself African for all sorts of reasons. That is not going to happen. But I completely understand why people would want me to do that and why it's important and why it's problematic that I might refer to myself as black. But to argue about it for a day rather than thinking about how we could do other things and think about taking the politics, given that we are always going to have those different ideas, I think is important, but we need to sort of bear that in mind, that it doesn't take away from the political projects that we do all have in common, which I assume is a kind of broadly anti-racist project. And I think, divided we fall in the face of the UK. There are urgent things to be dealt with, and undermining them through those smaller disagreements, although they are really important. How we find that balance, I think, is going to be one of the most urgent political conversations to have over the coming months leading up to the election.
Miranda, one more round of questions after this.
Well, as a white Brit, I think who grew up with the concept of black covering both groups, I think it's unfortunate that there has been the division and the separation. And when I'm organising stuff on for Black History Month, or in Wandsworth what we now call Diversity Month, we try and ensure both the African dimension and the South Asian dimension. But it seems to me there are potentially two fault lines that are yet to open up. One is between those of African heritage who are Christian and those of African heritage who are Muslim, and that's all wrapped up partly with the growing Islamophobia issue. The second fault line is the fact that increasingly in our inner city schools, we're not just talking about black Brit kids and people of African heritage kids, we're talking about people from all kind of different parts of the world, increasingly from East Europe, and how do we begin to tackle the history of their contribution as peoples in the past to this country. I mean, after all those people who were opposed to the Poles, have they forgotten a third of the pilots in the Second World War in the Battle for Britain were Polish pilots? You know, there's a whole area of work that's being done, that's got to be done. I'm not saying it's going to have to be people in this hall because you're all deeply involved in Black British history, but it's a serious issue that has got to be addressed.
One last round of questions. Two questions. Very brief. It's very brief.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I'll just make a comment. Look, when you're talking about Black British history and the Caribbean, you've got to remember in ancient data, you've got to remember that there were Indians who came and Chinese. So you can't really separate them if you want to. I just made that comment.
Sorry, I just wanted to say, there was a gentleman across your corner who just left, and his name's Robin Walker, who wrote an amazing book, When We Ruled, and I really wanted to get him in, but he's just left, literally, a fantastic book. What I was going to say, to take this forward, can teachers find a database where they tap in a name, tap in this you as an organisation, and all your faces come up with your synopsis, you know, about who you are?
We're working on that. You can be part of that database, fill in the form, have the picture on there.
Thanks. It's Corinne Fowler. I just wanted to endorse what's been said about the arts as a useful companion on this journey. I'm director of the Centre for New Writing from Leicester, which incidentally has lots of Asian Ugandans, so that kind of complicates the whole question, doesn't it? But I'll be very brief just to say that we have tried to pioneer a whole load of techniques for getting historians to work with writers, and so far we've found money to commission over 50 pieces of writing. So if anyone has any particularly complex or challenging histories that they want to artists to engage with, or writers in particular, then, you know, let me know.
Hi, my name is Kelly Foster. It's interesting to be on from the last question, which was talking about writing. And since we're here with a number of people who've written, about to write, or about to publish books, and a publisher, I just wanted to ask about avenues for this research to make some of the research that we've heard about today public. Do you feel that publishers are interested in publishing histories of black people in Britain? Do you think that people are still writing about them? Is there a market for it? It feels as though publishing-wise things have slowed down over the past decade or so. And it's just to mention, biography-wise, I know Benny Simon, who was at the British Library, had quite extensive bibliography that might be useful. I'm not sure whether that was last updated though. But yeah, publishing and writing, is that still a viable way to get the research out there?
I wanted to thank Kwaku for his comment a bit earlier about the national curriculum, and I think, you know, it was a painful struggle watching that last debate over the last curriculum, but clearly that one is one we're stuck with for now. And I know that I heard Martin Spafford give a great presentation on what we can do with what they've been given, and I think, again, it's like, I think this has come up again today, institutions aren't just institutions, they are groups of individuals, and so I think we have to focus on approaching, making relationships with individuals within institutions, be they your local school or the government or whatever, but we've got to kind of think about persuading people on an individual basis and in that way changing institutions. But no, Kelly, I wanted to respond to your point about the market. So I think actually the paper that spoke most clearly to that today was actually David Olusoga's on television, and I think a lot of the comments he made about television are similar, can be read across into publishing in general. I think that there was actually a really interesting article. There's a magazine called Mislexia, which is aimed at women writers, that was guest edited by Bernardine Evaristo in the last edition, and the cover piece was "Is there apartheid in publishing?" and and explored some of these issues. But I think that what David said about television is true about the market in general. It's like if you've got a good story, you can sell it, and that's the thing. I think. I would say, I worked with a traditional agent, and we approached a lot of publishers to get a deal for my book, Black Tudors. It wasn't, the most, it certainly wasn't, in the same, in any way the same kind of league as Kate Middleton's Sisters Advance, that's for sure. But I think, I don't think they are interested in, I don't get the feeling they're interested in this subject per se for its own sake in the way that we are perhaps, but I think that what we've got to be thinking about is how do we tell these stories in a way that they become relevant to everybody? And they are, we know that they're relevant to everybody, but it's a case of, thinking about how to communicate that, to everyone. Because a lot of the time we've been talking about young black audiences, I suppose, today, but I think it's just as important for all British people to understand this part of their history, so that they never vote for you. But
we've run out of time. There was one question on Twitter that came up. One question, and the question is very simple. It was, I need help. I don't know. I'm a historian. I don't know whether I'm a digger, I'm a pugilist, or a choreographer. And I want the panel to say one word. What they are. Are you a pugilist, are you a digger, or a choreographer? Steve.
Very diplomatic, but I'd say we would all count ourselves on the
I'm a digger, I'm a train spotter.
Okay, I'm all three, and you're not on my network for information about British Black History initiatives, then see me afterwards.
That's the way pugilists
I think I was trained to dig. I quite like going into the ring, but I'd rather be in the middle of the dance floor, dancing with you all, and changing partners, passing people around in a big kind of country dance or something with some African drums.
Someone asked me what I am, and at the risk of being sycophantic to my two panelists at the end, I've got to be all three. That complex admixture that makes us all fundamental individuals. So we're going to thank you. Before you go, remember this is your future. This is our future. These folks will love.